My name is James Quintero. I'm the director of the Center for Local Governance. It's a pleasure to have you all here. Local debt is one of the center's big issues because we think it represents a big threat to the Texas model of low taxes and limited government. I always like to start off, when possible, with a quote from the always great Ronald Reagan. During his first inaugural address, President Reagan had this to say about government debt. He says, "You and I, as individuals, can, by borrowing, live beyond our means, but only for a limited time. Why then should we think that collectively, as a nation, we are not bound by that same limitation?" Reagan's words are as applicable at the federal level as they are at the local level. But unfortunately, it's a message that has not resonated with our local communities. According to the latest data from the Texas Bond Review Board, local governments in Texas, which include cities, counties, school districts, and special districts, have amassed about $196 billion in debt. Now, on a per-person basis, and by the way, that's as of fiscal year 2012, so it doesn't include any of the latest initiatives. But on a per-person basis, that works out to be about $7,500 per person. Now, as if that weren't enough, that's actually only a partial look at government debt, because that only accounts for principal. When you account for interest, then you're looking at a figure that is closer to $323 billion, and that's just local government. That works out to roughly $12,500 for every man, woman, and child in the state. Now, the trend suggests that that figure is only going to get bigger. If you look at the comptroller's Your Money and Local Debt, what we see is that from 2000 to 2009, population and inflation have increased by about 45%. Now, you compare that to local spending, and that includes all local entities, your cities, counties, school districts, etc. Their combined total local spending has increased by 84%. So significantly higher than population and inflation, but not quite as worrisome as local debt. If you look at local debt over that same period, you're looking at a 145% increase. And so what we're seeing is that local debt is on an unsustainable trajectory. Now, we've kind of talked about the problem, and one of the things that I hope to take, that you all take out of this panel, are some solutions. And that's why I've asked these very knowledgeable individuals to come and help us with identifying some solutions and some ways that we can begin to educate and engage the public on this issue, which is very much a threat to the Texas model of low taxes and limited government. And so with that said, let me introduce our first speaker. She joins us from the Texas Comptroller's Office, Beth Hallmark, who serves as the creative director and the manager in the Data Services Division. In her position, Beth has helped lead the agency's efforts to driving and implementing new approaches to government transparency and public interaction with government information and data. And so with that, please help me welcome Beth Hallmark.
Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to get out and visit with people about the resources we have at the Comptroller's Office. And where our focus has been and continues to be is shining a light on government finances. We started at the state level, and we've increasingly added the local level. So before I sort of dive into the resources that we've been working on the past several months to really gather information and shine a spotlight on local government debt, I wanted to just take a minute and sort of chart our progression on financial transparency since Susan Combs, who's the comptroller, took office 7 years ago this month. So her first week in office, January 2007, Comptroller Combs posted the expenditures of the Comptroller's Office down to the pens and pencils on the Comptroller's website, Window on State Government. At the time, people thought, oh, you've just opened a can of worms. People will have so many questions. You'll get calls. People will start ringing off the hook. That didn't happen. People appreciate having that information out there. Not long after that, a couple of months, 23 of the largest state agencies' expenditure information was posted on that same webpage, and that represented 80% of all the state spending in Texas. That summer, we actually launched our Where the Money Goes website, where we shine an increasing light on state spending and where your tax dollars go. And by October, based on legislation that passed that session, we actually had one of the country's first virtual check registers, which showed every check sent from every state agency from the state of Texas. And today, that's up today, going back multiple fiscal years. A year after that, we started to look at the landscape of local government transparency, and just to gauge how transparent is local government, because as the state's chief fiscal officer, the comptroller's office really is a portal for people to understand where their money goes and where their tax money goes. You heard James mention our report series, Texas, It's Your Money. The comptroller's philosophy is it's not the government's money, it is the taxpayers' money. So the first thing we did was just take a look and see how transparent are local governments. And it was just an audit of what was out there, looking at who has a budget online, who has a check register online. A year after that, and I have to say there were some surprises, some small communities that really were taking leadership on this issue and being more transparent. So a year after that, to incentivize and encourage local governments at every level of transparency, we launched our Leadership Circle, which has 3 levels, gold, bronze, and silver. And we really want to encourage local governments who are just starting with their transparency efforts and those that were really leading the way, gather their success stories so that we could share those with other local governments to try and lead the way. And then, of course, we started to realize our house could be bigger on the state side. So in May 2010, we expanded Where the Money Goes to our actual Texas Transparency web portal. And with that, we added the other side of the equation, where the money comes from. We actually also added an open data center, which is the raw data, so anybody could slice and dice all of this rich expenditure information. And then just last year, the comptroller, I'm forgetting it's 2014. The year before that, the comptroller launched a series of town hall meetings, and she started to hear people really expressing concern about government debt. And she asked the question, how many of you know how much your government owes? And that means how much you owe, and debt your government has taken out in your name. And nobody really knew the answer. And so that launched our quest to find out and to put together a series of reports, which was called Texas, It's Your Money. Specifically, our first report looked at who's taxing you. The second one looked at local government debt. Where is it? What are the trends? And you saw the chart James pulled up that is, there's definitely a trend on the upward side. And then looked at education debt specifically. City and school district debt, of course, are the bulk of your local government debt. And then looked at public pension debt. Let's see. Excuse me. In that series of reports, we also had recommendations from the comptroller's office on how to make information more readily available to the public. That did lead to proposed legislation in the 83rd session. Specifically, there was a bill, House Bill 14, its companion Senate Bill 14, to provide more transparency on the local level, specifically around bonds and debt. That did not make it to a vote, so not long after the session, we launched under Susan's leadership a website called Tell the Truth Texas. And the goal of that was just to start to bring together and gather all of the existing available information on debt and local finances and our own, keep our own house in order too. So where are we on state debt? And that's been a really successful site. If you go there, you can find tools to look at what are bond election timelines, what is information that a taxpayer needs to be empowered. I mean, our role in this, as I said, is to shine a light and just inform taxpayers. Right before the end of the year, we expanded our Texas Transparency Portal one more time. I call it Transparency 5.0 because that's really where we are. We're always continuing to expand and grow. And as a part of that, the local debt information has been where we've really tried to shine the spotlight. And we started with our Debt at a Glance profile series. So we launched this late last year. We started with the top 20 cities and the top 20 counties, and we worked with our other sister agencies who collect this information, the Bond Review Board, other entities and organizations that collect information and share it on bond election and bond debt, and the Municipal Advisory Council of Texas. And what we were trying to do with this was to provide the debt context that a voter would need when they walked into the voting booth to decide on more debt. I'm happy to say that just this week we're up to the top 100 cities, top 100 counties. We have the top 100 school districts, and not too long from now we're going to start looking at special purpose districts and where that debt falls. I don't know if any of you had a chance to look at our website or check out this resource, but I did provide some screenshots to kind of walk you through how we tried to provide this context for voters to understand local debt. So when you go to each of our debt at a glance profiles, one thing I don't have a screenshot of, but it does show you the population in question of the city or the county or the school district, because obviously population growth is a factor in some of these trends. And then we show the debt trends. So the first thing we felt like would be helpful for people to understand where things stand now was just to see what are the current debt obligations and what are the current tax rates in this local government, because that's the context in which you're voting in more new debt. Second to that, what are the trends? Is the debt going up? Is it going down? How is it? When is it spiked? And I promise I'm not picking on Austin. I just Austin starts with an A, and we're in Austin, so I thought perfect candidate. So nothing devious in pulling this up. But you can see at a glance, all this information was available in different places, but it wasn't in a chart over time. And that's what we were trying to do, was give that snapshot picture of where it falls. Of course, how Austin compares, how this local government compares with cities of similar size, or if it's a school district with a school district of similar enrollment, or if it's a county, of course, with a county of similar size. Because that's important too when you're looking at, is this in line, is this out of line, how does this compare? And then another important issue we thought to highlight would be authorized but unissued debt. Because as you're looking at voting in new debt, what's already been approved that is still sort of on the books. And you can see it's quite a bit, and there are valid and good reasons for all of this. But our goal is just to shine a light. Yes?
Is this just the city of Austin?
Yes.
Okay, so it doesn't include Austin ISD.
Correct. But we do have Austin ISD in our school district lookup. But yes, this is just the city of Austin. We also wanted to spotlight certificates of obligation, which can be issued under certain special circumstances, but do not require voter approval. So we felt like that would also be important to spotlight and to show how that's been issued over time. So you can see with Austin, the trends there. 2012 was a big year. And then we wanted to show what were some of the most recent bond elections for this government entity and how did those turn out. So you can see here what was approved in Austin and what was defeated. And then also what's coming up down the line, proposed bond issuances. And this is where you really have to dig deep to try and find this information. Yes, sir?
We can't read that from back here. Is it possible you might just tell us what some of those numbers are on the side? The chart tomorrow. I can't see what the top number would be.
So if I'm looking at Austin certificates of obligation issuances, in 2003 it was about 35 million, and in 2012 it was just over 50 million. And 2012 obviously is, you can see on the highest one at the end there. And then all of their bonds for the last election were approved, with the exception of a bond for a housing facility for 78 million. And our website, I'll show it at the end, but it's texastransparency.org, and all this information is linked from there. And we did bring a handout that's on the back that sort of walks through our Tell the Truth Texas website and what we have available for the top cities, counties, and school districts. Thank you. In fact, there it is. So, texastransparency.org, and if you want to know, even from a state level, where do your tax dollars go, this is your one-stop portal, and that's really, our role as the state's chief fiscal officer is on the state spending side. But as we've worked to become a leader in Texas transparency, we really feel like people look to us for transparency information, and that's why we have continued to shine a spotlight on local government as well. And there are local governments all across the state who have really stepped up to the plate to be more transparent, and there's always more work to do. And even on our side, we're always looking for more we can do. And I really invite everyone to visit our site. We have feedback mechanism, feedback loops. We tell people over on our site, if you know of a bond election or you know of a piece of information we don't have here, let us know, because we're really trying to engage citizens with this information and get everybody involved. Thank you. I think I made it right under time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Beth. It's always been my thought process that before you can engage on an issue, you need to educate the public. And before you can educate the public, you need to have the information and data made publicly available and done so in a very clean way. And the Comptroller's Office has, for many years now, done a spectacular job of making a lot of this information not only available but digestible. And so I think what you guys are doing is absolutely fantastic.
Thank you very much.
Our next speaker needs very little introduction. She's been a conservative warrior for many years. Peggy Venable, who is I believe, just recently promoted to.
Knows what my title is.
Well, former Texas State Director of Americans for Prosperity. Please help me welcome Ms. Peggy Venable.
Thank you so much. I am delighted to be here and want to thank TPPF for this panel and for this discussion, but also for the great work that you do. They truly are not just a think tank, but they are a do tank. And they get a lot done. I know my counterparts in other states would like to have a TPPF in every one of those states. All of us have just enjoyed the holidays. And by the way, Happy New Year, if I've not seen you yet. But we all make New Year's resolutions. And usually a resolution has something to do. How many of you have a resolution that includes losing weight or exercising or eating better? Well, I've already broken all of mine, so forget that. But let's see. What we at Americans for Prosperity are really talking about how we can, in this new year, focus more on not just economic freedom, but economic well-being. And in doing so, we can all tell when we're gaining a little bit of weight, but the fact is when government gets bigger, we often don't know. And this is one thing I think local government is really largely not understood by so many people. I've traveled the state for the last few years talking about local government debt, and I've had people tell me I'm crazy. I've been practically run out of town by some local government officials, but taxpayers are always very receptive to the information because the fact is very few people have any clue how much local government debt is being carried. We all know that good policies have really helped create the winning economic environment that we have here in Texas. We're so fortunate that we have a state that is a right-to-work state. We have no state income tax. We have relatively low taxes in Texas. And yet, many people are surprised to know that we are leading the country, a leading state in the country, in local government debt. Now, to put this in perspective, studies are always done. You can see the Freedom of the 50 States or the Rich States, Poor States, and all the studies that are done that rank the states where we are in economic freedom or in other indicators. The interesting thing is Texas ranks very high in our economic productivity and the economic performance ranking. But when it comes to the economic outlook, we rate much lower. And the interesting thing is, if you look down the fine print and what ALEC and others have put out, you find that where we rank worst is in the debt service as a share of tax revenue, or in how much local government debt we are carrying. By the way, we're 46th in debt service, and 50 is worse. Scale of 1 to 50. You don't want to be 46. We certainly don't. Now, let me just share with you something that I always travel with as I travel the state. Two things. One is a picture of local government debt in Texas. You may not be able to read this, but just let me share with you what we do. We talk about local government debt, about $322 billion. I have that little asterisk there and a little explanation at the bottom that we always include principal plus interest, and I'll tell you in just a moment why. But we want people to get an idea of what local government entities are carrying the greatest debt. To no surprise, the largest is ISDs. Of course, it is always for the children, isn't it? It's always for the children. And they're at about $106, $107 billion. Cities right after that. And then the water districts, when we vote on water debt, we seldom realize that we're already $50 billion in water debt, even before this last election. So we give people that information, but we also always take a one-pager on just how much their school districts, their cities, and their counties are carrying in debt. And I will tell you, it is a shock to people. It is such a shock to people that I'll tell this little story that I'm embarrassed to tell this story because I always hate to embarrass local government officials, of course. But I had one call me, my school district, I'm in Round Rock ISD. Someone called me on the school board and asked that we not oppose a bond initiative, and they were making the case for how much the school district had grown and all these reasons why they needed more bond indebtedness, why they needed this bond initiative. So I asked a question, a really simple question of someone who is on a school board. Do you know how much debt we're currently carrying in Round Rock ISD? Crickets. No answer. And finally she said, well, I'm ashamed to say I don't know. Well, you should be ashamed, I said. By the way, it was $1.1 billion. Would you be ashamed if you didn't know you were $1.1 billion in debt, but you're asking for voters to approve more? Well, I haven't heard from her again. The reason why we always include principal plus interest, and this is one really poster child example. It is an outlier, but is not the only one. Leander ISD, just for example, right outside Austin here, Leander ISD, you won't be able to read this. I just want to show this is right off the Texas Bond Review Board website, which is updated only once a year as of August 31st, 2013. But this school district owes twice as much in interest as it does in principal. $970.7 million in principal, but $1.7 billion in interest, for a total debt of $2.7 billion. Wow. So why do we include principal plus interest? I think it's important. Taxpayers need to know how much they owe, the whole picture. And it also shows us some of the financing gimmicks that are probably being used. Now again, we in Texas like to be number one for everything. Being number two is not a good thing in this instance, by the way, though, because we're second only to New York State in per capita local government debt. We are second only to California, I refer to as the Greece of America, in local government debt total. So not a great place to be. And you know, the interesting thing is, and I will tell you, my daughter's here in the audience, the gene pool is right here, and I think this is really intergenerational theft. What we are doing to the next generation is really unacceptable. I've got 5 minutes, I'll fly through the next few. But, you know, we can't simply use the excuse that we're a growing state because other states are growing too, but per capita tells us a lot. We truly are robbing our kids and grandkids of their opportunity to enjoy the American dream. And whereas local officials may agree that it's taxpayer-supported dollars, and we know that very often the taxpayers don't know just how much they owe. And I'm so pleased to see the Comptroller's office here, and Tom Curry's done great work on this issue too and has spoken to some of our groups. But the fact is the Comptroller's really done a lot to shed light on this issue. Their websites that you saw earlier, really helpful. The Texas Bond Review Board, I used to think I was the only person that ever accessed that website. Even state legislators often didn't know about it. As a matter of fact, they called me one time and said, are we doing okay by you? Actually, they didn't that next year because they quit including principal plus interest in the total. They added it quickly after I contacted the governor's office and suggested that they find a way to add that back to their website. Evidently, some local taxing entities weren't too happy that we were using that information. But local taxing entities' websites often carry this information, but not often enough. Now, I might just say the Comptroller Award won our first Trailblazer for Transparency Award this year, and we're so pleased at the work that she is doing, and I know Luann Anderson here in the audience and I were at her first town hall meeting, and so pleased that she traveled the state talking about these issues. Well, what can citizens do? We encourage people to show up. You know, government goes to those who show up. If we don't show up, then our local officials somehow think that it's a-okay, whatever they're doing. So we need people to show up, to ask questions. These are things that I talk about to our activists. when I'm sharing information with them. Do your research, or we do it for them. Talk to the media. We encourage people to use their social media, Facebook, Twitter. Let people know in their community how they feel about these issues. Join organizations that they agree with, the Texas Public Policy Foundation, ours, and others. And we also remind them, let policymakers know how you feel about their issues, even if you support them. How often do people forget to say thank you to the local officials for voting against a bond initiative or for opposing something that they wanted opposed? Now, we also have some policy recommendations, and the Comptroller's Office kindly did not go through the gyrations of what happened with SB and House Bill 14 during the legislative session. But just to be brief, local government officials appeared en masse to oppose a good government transparency bill. So we certainly want to continue to push that legislation this next session. We want to really ban local governments from being able to use capital appreciation bonds. There's no need for that. Voters ought to approve all of the debt. We really want greater transparency, and that really was part of what those pieces of legislation would do. That when local governments are asking to increase debt, they ought to tell us how much debt we're carrying already. But one person who testified said, well, if we had to do that, they may not approve more debt. Hello? Yeah, good point. Require a minimum voter turnout. You know, about 5 to 7% generally turn out on these bond initiatives, and yet the debt is going to be shared by everybody. We want to make sure that we increase voter participation there. And if a bond election fails, they shouldn't be able to continue to come back at the taxpayer time and time again until they wear them down. They ought to have some kind of a cooling off period. Don't go back to the taxpayers for the next 12 months and ask for another bond initiative. Maybe then they would come to us the first time with a more reasonable proposition. And here is my pet peeve. I can't speak ever without talking about this. End taxpayer-funded lobbying. We are paying for lobbyists who then come to Austin to lobby against us. We elect local officials to represent us, introduce them to their telephone or to their local legislator or congressman so they can be talking to one another, and not hire lobbyists as intermediaries so that the local officials are one step removed from the bad policies that are being promoted by many of these lobbyists. And the first thing we could do, at least, is promote transparency in taxpayer-funded lobbying. And I know we've talked about this before, but they ought to be able to be required to disclose precisely how much they're getting paid, precisely what issues they are working on, and precisely the position they are taking. I'm not saying every lobbyist has to, but if we're paying them, we have a right to know, and we should. So that kind of sums that up. I first want to say I recognize Ernest Angelo in the audience here, former Midland mayor, a great friend and a great mentor to me. I'm a great fan of his. And I know on the panel here, Keith Self, we have some local officials that are doing a great job for us. But we're encouraging more people to get involved. I also want to say Local Voices Solutions, sitting right here in the audience, a new organization that's doing a great job helping local activists get more engaged. Thanks so much.
Good information and great recommendations as always, Peggy. Thank you very much. Our next speaker actually hails from the Washington, D.C. area, and he brings a little bit of a national perspective. Ben Wilterdink is a research analyst for the Center for State Fiscal Reform at the American Legislative Council. He collaborates with state legislators and fiscal policy experts to develop fiscally responsible, free market, and pro-growth policy solutions. His work has appeared in Forbes, Real Clear Policy, and the Washington Examiner. Please help me welcome Mr. Ben Wilterdink.
All right. Well, I'd like to first thank James and Jess and TPPF for allowing me to come out here and speak on this topic and escape the 7-degree weather of DC. I would also like to give a quick shout out to Representative Laubenberg, who is our Texas State Chair for ALEC. So thank you for being here today as well. So I don't have a PowerPoint, so you're going to have to use your imagination. When they first asked me to speak on this topic, one of the first things I was thinking about was, okay, what is the biggest driver of local debt and what is it going to be 5, 10, 15 years down the road. And I think most people might be surprised it's not going to be the same things. I'm here to tell you today that it is one thing that is the biggest fiscal challenge for both states and municipalities when it comes to local debt, and that's unfunded pension liabilities. That's, I can say hands down, if it's not the number one problem right now, it will be in about 5 to 10 years. We're seeing it in Detroit, in Stockton, Central Falls, Rhode Island. There's a handful of other ones as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what that is, what that means, unfunded pension liability, and talk a little bit about that and some other solutions to stop this from doing that. So first, I would like to say that the way that municipalities, and this is true for states as well, the way they do pensions is something called a defined benefit plan, which I'm going to assume most of you in the room are aware of. All it means is that they are promised a certain amount of dollars per month from the day that they retire to when they die, and sometimes that includes survivors' benefits as well. But what that does is it puts the entire risk for the pension plan on the employer, in this case, which is the local government or the state government, which, as they've been very good in sharing, the governments don't have any money, it's taxpayer money. So essentially what's going on is the entire risk is on the taxpayer to pay for these things. So there are three main reasons why the defined benefit pension model isn't sustainable in the way that it has been in the past. And so I'll go through those at first before we jump into what some of the solutions are. The first one is what's called an assumed rate of return. So the state or the employer and the municipality puts in a certain amount of money on behalf of each employee, and then that goes into a big fund, and there's interest earning on that. But the way that they determine how much money to put in per employee is based on a formula that includes an assumed rate of return on all of those investments. Now, 9 out of 10 cities and states assume that they're going to get 8% return every year. Every year, from now to infinity, 8%. That's a ridiculous assumption, if I might say so. I mean, Moody's Analytics says that it should be 5.5%. That's the rate that corporations use. State Budget Solutions says that due to the risk-free nature of pension obligations, they should use a 15-year Treasury bond, which is 3.225%. So they're just way off the mark with that 8% rate of return. And the problem is if they don't get that 8% rate of return, let's say one year you get 4%, you can't make it up by getting 12% the next year, because you have to account not only for what you lost, but for what you would have gained that you actually didn't. So we can go into that a little bit more if there are questions later. The second reason why it's mostly unsustainable is because they don't use generally accepted accounting practices when they talk about how much to put in, how much actuarial liability there is. They use a different government set of books, which if a private company tried to do that, they would be thrown in jail or indicted by the SEC. In fact, Illinois was just indicted by the SEC for pension fraud, and that's an entire state. But what they do is something called asset smoothing, which is usually done over a 5-year period, which says, for instance, in the 2008 market downturn, those losses from, I guess it's 2014, so those losses from about 6 years ago are now just coming on the books. So they can smooth out these losses over a long period of time to make things appear as if they're actually doing better than they are. That's the second reason that these things are very unsustainable. The third reason is the assumptions they use about the demographics in the workforce, which basically means, how much are wages going to increase at the market rate to pay for this labor? How much, how long are people going to live? And, that kind of thing, cost of living adjustments. And some of the tricky things they do to get around the obligations and the tricky things they do to try to make the debt from these unfunded liabilities look lower than it actually is is they will say, okay, we have these workforce right now, and they can retire at 55 and take their full pension, but we're going to assume that they're going to work until they're 65, and then they'll retire 10 years after they need to. And also, once they retire, they will immediately die, or something equally as preposterous, to just to highlight, how much. And then, if that's part of your equation, if you have that, then all of a sudden your liability for how much these people are going to earn in pension benefits over their lifetime dramatically reduces. So those are the three main reasons. There are a few others that I could go into why defined benefit pension plans are not a sustainable model for the future. Now, that's not to say that I think that we should end them altogether right away. I think that one of the most important things we can do, as most people in this room are conservatives, we honor contracts, we keep the promises that we make, and we need to do that in this case. There's no way around it. We need to honor what we've said we're going to give these people. But the problem is we are issuing new debt that we can't pay for every time we hire a new state employee because they're being funneled right into the same broken system. And in fact, one of the things that some of the people who want to keep the status quo will tell me is that, well, we have to have these people go into the same pension system because they need to pay for the retirees now. And so just think about that. So you need the new investors to come in to pay for the existing and older ones. I mean, that's by definition, that is a Ponzi scheme. You're supposed to be paying these things as they go. Most often they don't, and these are some of the reasons why. I'd like to continue to go into, besides the pension issue, it's going to become more and more difficult for states to get bonds and issue more bonds of any kind. And I'll tell you the reason for that is because Stockton is one of the largest cities to go bankrupt because of pension issues before Detroit. Detroit kind of overshadowed the Stockton bankruptcy. But what happened was when they went to federal bankruptcy court, the bondholders, all the people that issued and gave the city money for these bonds, all of their debt got a big haircut. So in other words, the city was no longer on the hook to pay for a large portion of their bond debt that they had already accrued and agreed to pay. Meanwhile, the biggest creditor for the city of Stockton was the CalPERS California pension system. They got a 0% haircut, and they were given everything, which immediately made Fitch and Moody's and some of the other credit rating agencies downgrade the rest of their debt, first of all, and then also start downgrading the debt for other cities and municipalities with high pension unfunded liabilities. And so I realize that sounds a little complicated. The gist of it, though, is that because this issue is not being taken seriously by municipalities and localities, it's becoming more risky and therefore more expensive to use debt and buy debt. And so that's going to be a major problem in the future anytime that they want to expand or issue any kind of new debt. So those are some of the challenges that municipalities face. I think those are going to be the cost drivers for debt into the future. So then I will kind of conclude with a few examples from around the country and also a few solutions, so I didn't depress you completely. The first example as far as a solution is actually something that the mayor of Van Ormy was speaking about in an earlier panel called zero-based budgeting. That basically means that every new year that you're doing budgets, you reset to zero, you evaluate how much money it's going to take to run the core functions of government, and then you budget based on that. Excellent way to do it. That's number one recommendation. Number two is transparency, which I'm happy to say that Texas is by far leading the country in local municipal debt transparency. Because if people know about it, then they're less likely to issue more of it and less likely to keep digging into this hole. The third one is transferring over new hires into a defined contribution system or a 401k style system. This is basically a way of capping that liability. to say that, okay, we're not going to accrue any more debt for pensions. We're going to pay for it as we go because we're going to contribute money into the defined contribution every year. And if they don't, the employees can sue. Whereas now in the defined benefit system, if a state doesn't pay what they're supposed to do into it, they don't have standing to sue. So that is a good idea of where to start. So those three that I'll leave you with: zero-based budgeting, transferring over to a defined contribution system, and just plain and simple, more transparency. It can be done. San Jose and San Diego both passed meaningful reform in 2012 through ballot initiative to cap their unfunded pension liabilities. They're currently in court right now, and so I think we'll see how that goes. But it can be done. And the last thing I'll leave you with, if you take away nothing from my presentation, is don't be Chicago. Chicago is the worst city to follow as far as unfunded pension liability debt. In fact, Mayor Rahm Emanuel, a famous right-winger, said that if they didn't get the debt under control, property taxes would have to go up by 150%. And I just want to leave you with those are the stakes that we're playing with, and not many people are very far behind Chicago. Thank you.
Thank you for that great information, Ben. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe ALEC also has model legislation posted online. Does any of that have to do with perhaps the local debt issue?
Yes. Yeah,
Good.
it does. It's a lot of it's transparency stuff. Some of it's defined contribution. And I should have mentioned there are books in the back that go much deeper into this problem. Rich States, Poor States, right there, which is what Peggy mentioned, the state ranking system, and then the other one is a pension guide.
Excellent. Thank you. I want to introduce our next panelist now, the Honorable Keith Self. Judge Self has been has served as the Collin County Judge since 2007. Collin County has more than 800,000 citizens and is one of the fastest growing counties in the nation. The judge was appointed to the United States Military Academy at West Point by Congressman Bob Price, and he graduated in 1975 and went on to serve on active duty for 25 years. Please help me welcome Collin County Judge Keith Self.
Let me be very clear, I am not here to provide the other side of this discussion. But I will tell you, I'm a rookie here at TPPF Policy Orientation, and I was very aware the very first luncheon. I signed in, and that little tag that tells you where you were supposed to eat, y'all are all familiar with them, said table number 3. I said, okay, I'll go find table number 3. As I'm walking down the center aisle, it became very apparent that table number 3 was the head table right underneath the podium. And I said, uh-oh, I'm in the wrong place. So I walk up to table number 3. I introduce myself to the first person there, who just happens to be the founder and chairman emeritus of this great organization. And I said, I'm supposed to be at table number 3, I think. We looked, there's no name tag. Introduced myself to a second, and I mean, you know, Brooke Rollins is right there, the chairman's right there. And I introduced myself to a second director. And he said, well, let's look again. So we looked again, there was no tag, and it dawned on me, I'm the rookie. It was kind of like back when I was at Fort Bragg, there was Area J, which was just a big area training area, and you sent the rookies out to find the keys to Area J. Well, there were no keys to Area J. So I had been sent down to table 3 as the rookie. So I've got my position in life now. I am from Collin County, and as James says, we're certainly a fast growth county. Pull up my slides. Let's go through a few of them. I think when you've got an elected official talking to you about a subject here, you ought to demand that he tell you what his particular entity is doing in this. You will decide whether it's good or bad, but I'm going to give you some comparisons. These are some of our city governments, Frisco, Plano. We do have part of the city of Dallas in Collin County. Denton City obviously is not, and Austin City is not. You see here the debt per capita current are in the thousands of dollars, Plano being the least at 1,371. Next slide. Then we go to the counties. My county is at the top here. It goes down. Now, these are the counties we tend to compare ourselves to because they're similar size, similar fast growth, except for Travis, of course. So Collin, Denton, Williamson, and Montgomery, you see there the per capita debt, and we're fairly low. And next slide. And our debt service in this upcoming budget year is 14.8%. I will tell you, soon after I took office 7 years ago, we peaked at about 22%. So I think we're headed in the right direction, but 14.8% is what will be our debt service in the year in which we are today. Next slide. What a great setup Ben just gave me for pension plans. Because you want to focus on bond debts, I have to tell you, I believe that the Texas County and District Retirement System is one of the most dangerous entities for the county government in the future of Texas. The reason is they like to say that they are a cash balance plan. They are. But the taxpayer guarantees everything that you have promised your workers. Whether it be 7% employee contribution, 2-to-1 by the county, which means like a 21% at the end of the day they're promised, that becomes a defined benefit plan by the very fact you've promised them that. Yes, it's cash balance, but you backstop it. I told the chief investment officer of TCDRS at one of the conferences, I said, you have the greatest job in the world. You manage at that time $16 billion. And you're not required to make one thin dime off of it because the taxpayers back up to 8%. Now, he measures against his own metrics. If his similar sorts of funds make or lose 5% in any year, and he only loses 4%, he's done well. But as the county judge, I'm responsible for 8% every single year, regardless of what he makes. And that's what I have to manage against. Now, with that background, Collin County over the last 5 years has put in more than $50 million into TCDRS to fully fund our retirement program. To make that figure even worse for you, the money we have in the program today is about $225 million. We've put in a quarter of it in cash taxpayer dollars over the last 5 years to fully fund it. Why is that? Because TCDRS charges us interest at the 7% when our investments, as you know, are making about 0.5%. Okay? So it made sense for us to put this money up front. But I will tell you, most counties don't realize what's about to hit them because this year, before we put in that $11.6 million, TCDRS, with that discount rate of 8% that Ben talked about, said our unfunded liability for the last year, since we'd fully funded it, was $2.7 million. There are new GASB rules coming down that I think hit next year. Is that right, Ben? Yeah, next year. Everybody's going to have to go with a blended rate. So TCDRS told us our unfunded rate for this 1 year was $2.7 million. The GASB rate, more than $11 million. That was our $11.6 million that we put into it to keep it fully funded under the new GASB rules. TCDRS will hit the counties in this state hard next year in their CAFR and their Consolidated Annual Financial Report because they're going to have to report their true unfunded liability. Enough on TCDRS. Let's move to that SB 14. Collin County. We were the first county in the state to put our checkbook online. We now stream. Since I took office, we now archive. You can go back and see what Keith Self said 2 years ago. If you don't like it, you can call me today and tell me about it because it's still online. I believe in over-communicating with your taxpayers. Now, you can have websites, and I applaud the comptroller, but for your elected officials, we also need to be not only providing pull communications, that's a website where people can go to it and pull it down, we also need to be providing push communications. I write a weekly post, Facebook, email, so forth and so on, where I discuss with my constituents the issues of the day. And I will tell you, I believe I get some leeway because of that, because they understand that I'm trying to talk to them. And in terms of this bond debt, Peggy is exactly right. Nobody knows how much debt is out there, but what is different? Nobody knows how much you pay in federal income tax either. I bet you can't tell me. You know how much you get back in a refund, or you know how much you have to pay because you're underpaid, but I bet you very few people know exactly what you pay in federal income tax. Same with bonds. However, SB 14, I think had, in my mind, for counties, it boiled down to 3 charts, the guts of the bill with 3 charts. The first one, and these are layman's terms, this is the way I read it, was the tax rate and levy impacts. Your citizens don't know what a tax rate versus a tax is anyway. You've got to explain it to them. What's the tax rate versus the tax levy? The second chart was the total bond data. This particular bond, you had to explain it in a couple of data points that they wanted you to put in it. And the third one was your total debt, what we've been discussing here, total debt and repayment data. So everything that Peggy talked about. So those 3 charts, in my mind, were the guts of the bill for the county. All that data is available. So I'll borrow a phrase from Nike, just go do it. You don't need the government to tell you that you're going to have to make those 3 charts. You as a citizen organization, go get the data. It's available. Put the data together and get it out. Would we like for our state to do it? But I tell you, I don't know. Let me tell you how hard it is to change things that are meaningful to local officials. We changed our pension plan in 2010. I sat through 8 hours of basically half of the time was listening to our employees, half of the time was listening to our taxpayers. And boy, was it was visceral, and it was alive, let me tell you. So I say just go do it. If the state is not going to do this for you, you can do it. So just go do it. Now, let's talk about some unintended consequences, and I'll share a couple of stories with you. We cut our tax rate again this year, our county tax rate. The commissioner that wanted to make the motion got the words that we must say by state law. Now remember, we're reducing the county tax rate. He got the words we must say, and it says we're going to increase taxes, and the word was in there, and we had to say it according to our auditor. So he had to read the motion exactly as state law says. And he turns to me and he says, but we're reducing our tax rate. And I said, read it, I'll explain it. So at the bottom line, he didn't want to do it because he's running for state rep. So a different commissioner had to read the motion because it said we're increasing taxes, and that commissioner didn't want that to be recorded. I got it. So the unintended consequences that I do see in SB 14 is in that first chart I talked about, a tax rate and levy impacts. And the story is that if you put on there that this bond will increase the tax levy, you may have an unintended consequence, and here's why. Just this past week, I went to our financial advisor because I'm going to start a discussion with my taxpayers how we source the next big building of roads. And I said, if I sell this many bonds, what would that theoretically do to our tax rate? Came back and said it would increase it by 2 cents. Let me say, I have no intention of raising the tax rate in Collin County by anything, much less 2 cents. But here's the unintended consequences. If you tell the citizens that, and yet what I plan to do is go to my budget officer and say, we got to find 2 cents out of the M&O budget. Or can we afford 1 cent? But then you start, where are we going to find it? Because if we're not going to raise the tax rate, we're going to have to find the debt service tax funds somewhere, and I think we're going to find them as opposed to raising taxes. But that will not be clear in what SB 14 suggested. So the bottom line here is transparency. I believe in transparency. I believe in over-communicating, and we've got some great citizens groups that do that. And just go do it yourself. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Judge. At this time, I'd actually like to open it up for questions between the panelists. If anybody has said anything that they have a question about, or anything that comes to mind. Well, why don't we go to audience Q&A then? Yes, sir. Why don't we start right here in the front
I believe
row?
I heard it said that, I believe when transparency was first mentioned, a lot of the officials complained. Did you not say that?
Yes.
I assume they were fired right away, is that right?
Interestingly, we did post that on our website because we thought a lot of folks back home probably have no clue that their superintendent or their city council member, their mayor or county commissioner is before the legislature now opposing this legislation. So we posted online exactly everyone who testified or who weighed in opposition to that bill. And I got phone calls at home on Saturday mornings. Some people laughing, saying it's hilarious that you posted it, others not too happy about it. But yes, it was public information, it was online on the state website, legislative website. And most of them were there to oppose it. There were some there who actually had some very productive recommendations for changes in the legislation, which I think everyone is amenable to and welcome. But no, they were not fired. Now, interestingly, I might mention one other thing. One local activist just talked to me last week and said that they sent out a mailer to the voters in their area, letting them know that their superintendent had been before the legislature and opposed this legislation. So I thought that was very interesting. Perhaps others will do that.
I'll just share one short story. Several legislative sessions ago, after we had posted our checkbook online, I went down to testify in front of one of the committees about doing that. I took the IT director with me, and she testified that it cost us about $90 and about $25 a week, a month in maintenance for this. The county, which will remain unnamed, just south of us, a rather large county, testified that immediately after the IT director made that testimony, got up and said it would cost them several $100,000 to establish it and thousands of dollars a month to maintain it. It's what you want to do.
I wanted to help this next legislative session to fix a gaping hole in our taxpayer protections and laws in Texas. We have found out in San Antonio that no one has standing to challenge bonds that are misused from what their intended purpose was or what was promised to the voters. In San Antonio, we have a tax that was passed in 2004, and as part of the ballot initiative, voters were told that it would not be spent on light rail, it would not be spent on toll roads, half of it would go to transit, half would go to roads, and the money that went to roads would be used for matching grants. They're violating all of those promises, and we have looked at the statute, and no one has standing to enforce that. And we have asked the Attorney General to step in, which he did. He disapproved this last batch of bonds, but they're now being, the transit agency's attorneys are now suing the Attorney General to get that decision reversed. And I would like to intervene, but if I intervene in that lawsuit, they can impose a multi-million-dollar bonding requirement on me, and that I have to pay the attorney's fees for the transit agency and their lawyers if we do not prevail. So it's really stacked against the taxpayer, and this is something we need to fix.
Can I address that just briefly? My own school district, a poster child, it seems today, recently had a hearing that they were at a meeting. We're discussing $36 million in unspent bond money. They were talking about it as if it were leftover meatloaf. How were they going to use this leftover bond money? And they had the attorney come up and tell them they could legally use it for whatever purpose they wanted to. I, of course, stood up and said that they shouldn't, that it was a betrayal of taxpayer trust. Talked to some legislators about it, and they were absolutely aghast that ISDs and local entities can do this, can sell to us as the voters a bond initiative for one purpose and then spend that money for another purpose. They can, and that probably is something that needs to be, that loophole closed. Thanks for bringing that up.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, Mr. Wilson, in the using, looking at the liability stream relative to defined benefit plans, how has interest rates changed with
Well, are you talking about like as far as the new gas?
What was the question? The question was, as you raise interest rates, the liability stream normally comes in on the defined benefit plan, okay? We've had unusually depressed interest rates. And so I imagine you've looked at the relationships of assets to liabilities as those adjustments would occur, and what are we looking at there?
Okay, so if I understand it right, you're kind of talking about how when the market picks back up and we start meeting better returns, how does that affect the unfunded liability? Is that?
Well, as interest rates would adjust, then the liability stream would then adjust relative to the assets.
Sure. Well, I mean, it does improve. I mean, obviously, if interest rates pick up and we start meeting targets or exceeding targets, clearly, yes, you're going to have less unfunded liabilities. You're going to backfill a lot of that. But the problem is when it comes in where we've not met those investment returns, you have to make up much more because for the year that you didn't make those, you assumed 8%, so there's a gap there. And then the next year, if you make 8% was already assumed. That's a baseline. So to make up anything, you have to already hit 8%, and then you can start making up for what you missed last year. And so the problem is so pronounced. I can give you an example. In Utah, in 2007, Utah had, the state plan that is, had the best funded pension plan in the entire country. It was about 102% funded. Once the market crash hit in 2008, Representative Dan Lillienquist, who was the chair of the Pensions Committee, and actually wrote that guide for us, went to the people that ran the plan, and he was asking, okay, so we had one bad year, like, how does that affect us? They went from 100% down to less than 70% in 1 year. And that's how bad it is. And then so in the preceding years after that, they're just beginning to scratch the surface about getting out of that hole that was created.
Yeah, let's give some specifics. Let's say the market goes down 4%. That's not unreasonable, okay? The market loses 4% in 1 year. If you've guaranteed 8%, the next year you have to make 8% just to get level, plus 8%, which means the next year you have to get 16% to give both last year's and this year's. From one loss of 4%, the next year you have to have 16% to get last year and this year's return.
Hey, do we have the microphone?
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
I applaud all the speakers for bringing light to the debt issue, local debt issue. But even the horrendous numbers that you put up are understated for the reasons that they cited, the absence of the unfunded liability. And our citizens need to know, so I want to address this hallmark, I guess, from a transparency standpoint, need to know truth, not accounting principles. Accounting principles say that is not a balance sheet item for some very good reasons. But in truth, it is as much debt as any bond issue. I was visited by an accounting PhD from Japan who wants to change the system over there and label it on the balance sheet as future debt. And that's a wonderful thing, I think. So in terms of somehow being able, and maybe from an accounting standpoint, we can include it on the balance sheet, and granted, most citizens never look at the balance sheet, but at least maybe the media can pick it up. We need an asterisk or a footnote or something that highlights on the balance sheet the true liabilities of the city, which would include the unfunded liabilities for pensions and other benefits. Is there any accounting movement afoot to recognize that in any substantial way? Thank you.
Thank you. I can't speak to an accounting movement, but I can tell you as part of our Texas It's Your Money series, we did have a fourth report on public pensions in Texas. And with that, we have a public pension lookup tool on our transparency website that for all the public pension plans in Texas, it shows key financial information. And that tool is also linked from our Debt at a Glance profile pages that show the bond debt. So we're trying to sort of cross-link those together where we can.
If I could add just one thing to show just how bad the situation is, I was assisting in a city of about 35,000 people in deep financial trouble, and I called the finance director and said, give me a report on your unfunded liability. He not only didn't know what it was, he didn't know what it was. And I finally found out through the mayor it's $56 million, which is almost double that in the budget. That's the level of lack of understanding we have in this country of how severe this problem is becoming.
James, this gentleman, and then we have a yes or no question, and then that'll seal it off.
Would repealing the enabling legislation for certificates of obligation have a favorable impact on the municipal debt?
I think it would. You mean taking the authority away from the local entities to be able
Yes.
to issue COs?
Yes.
Absolutely. I forget the total that is in CO debt. It's on the comptroller's website, and I read it recently. I just don't have it on the top of my head. But absolutely it would. And then I remember, I sit through all these hearings, I remember the Texas Municipal League lobbyist sitting there saying, we really want to ask people to approve the debt. And one of the legislators fortunately said, well, then why don't you? Why do you issue COs? They couldn't answer that. But they hide behind, oh, we really want, our citizens to approve the debt, but they continue to issue COs.
So should we not be making an effort to have that happen?
Absolutely, we should. Thank you.
Just a quick question on fraud. I was told of a situation with a friend of mine who has a brother that did this in New York, where he was a policeman, and the way the retirement program worked, and I'm curious, the question is it happening in Texas? He asked me, and I don't know the answer. Hopefully y'all will. By the way, outstanding panel, what a wonderful group. But here's the question. Their retirement deal, I think, was 40% of their highest 2-year retirement, okay? Now, they were told, do not turn in your overtime. For your entire time you're there, you accrue it, but you waited till the last 2 years and turn it in. Instead of making 80 grand, I think is the number they used, they made like 300,000. Now, here's the problem. Where people were estimating they were going to retire making 40% of 80, they have 40% of 300. He's got a brother that just pulled this stunt. And he was asking me, is that true in the cities of Texas? Can they do that here? And I go, I have no clue.
It's called
So
spiking.
I'll just ask you, do y'all know?
It's called spiking, and often they can, not, I don't think in every plan, but there are recommendations to rein that in, most assuredly. I think that's in part of Alex's plan to stop that practice.
Yeah, we do have some model policy that kind of goes after that. And I will say sometimes municipalities in different states, they all do things a little bit differently. But I can say that particular scenario by no means is uncommon. That's an extremely common practice. I can't quite speak exactly to Texas, but I can say from across the United States, that happens very often.
That cannot happen in counties.
Well, with that, folks, I want to begin wrapping up. I know we have another program here.